He dipped his hand into the water and scooped up some of it. Sipping it, it tasted sweeter than normal. He noticed that the puddle itself wasn't draining. Slightly above his eye, a small hole had formed. There was one more option he hadn't considered yet. Inside the cabinet, housed an old rusted shotgun. Hey, this is Danny. I followed your instructions and found this like you said I would. It's a nice little plot of land. Truth be told, I don't think I've ever seen a spot in level 1 that's this open before. I got your water tap set up too. There's a couple of almond water puddles out there, so once I get this hooked up to one of them, I should be golden in terms of water. I appreciate y'all setting up something like this. I've always wanted to start up a little community away from Trader's Keep. This is really helping that dream come true. I imagine in about a month, you all will be able to send more people my way, and then we'll have a nice group going. I'll send another update in a week, like you asked. See you then. Danny unplugged the laptop the image he had given him and wandered towards the nearest almond water puddle. It had formed around a small dent in the concrete, probably from an entity or something else ages ago, and a small patch of water had started to form inside the hole. He kneeled down to the puddle and stuck one of the pipes he had been given firmly into the middle of the hole. Sure enough, the pipe started to siphon the water, filling up an empty carton he had placed below. In seconds, he had a container full of almond water and the hole had been emptied. He took a deep drink from the carton. He had grown almost numb to the taste of almond water at this point, though he hated it. It was important to stay hydrated in places like level 1, and it wasn't like he was going to find anything more appetizing. He put a cap over the rest of the container and stashed it in a small box he had taken with him. It was time to get to work and turn this little corner in level 1 into a home. Danny here. Been about a week since I got here, and things are slowly starting to take shape. Been using that water tap you gave me. Working on building these shacks is pretty damn exhausting, more so than I thought it'd be. Still, as of today, I've made a house of my own. It's real small, and you gotta crouch down on your knees to go into it, but I didn't have enough materials to make it much bigger. If y'all could send more, I'd appreciate it. Been having to go farther and farther out of camp to get more almond water. I'm storing most of it up for whenever you guys send more settlers my way, but I still don't think I have quite enough to support a whole community yet. That stuff saves lives. Still, things are going well. Be back in another week. Danny stood over a small crater of almond water. He had traveled almost a mile from camp to find this one, and it was much smaller than he had hoped. It was obvious to him now that he had been using up a lot of resources. He plunged the water tap into the hole and began siphoning it into another carton he had been carrying. As the water dried up, he saw that it had only filled a quarter of the container, the smallest amount he had ever received from a patch of almond water so far. Damn. Danny hoisted the tap up to his belt and started walking back towards camp. While building and setting up a camp had been easy, resource gathering in the Backrooms was near impossible for him. He was a worker, not a scavenger. The MEG had sent him quite a lot of supplies at the start, but they hadn't gone back to him yet, and it had almost been 3 weeks. He wanted the settlement to work. Hell, he needed it to work, but it was starting to frustrate him. As Danny neared the camp, he noticed something odd in the distance. There was another puddle, not very far from camp at all, and bigger than he had ever seen so far. This one must have been big enough to fill 3 different bottles at least. He marched over to the source. As he grew closer, his confusion worsened. How did he miss this? It was massive. He had combed the entire surrounding area and hadn't seen anything nearly as big as this before. As he reached the puddle, he kneeled down to it and looked closer. The water was darker than usual and somewhat thicker. Could it have been cashew water? No, he doubted it. It usually didn't show up in level 1. He dipped his hand into the water and scooped up some of it. Sipping it, it tasted sweeter than normal, almost sugary. Compared to regular almond water, it wasn't that bad at all. He began to siphon some of the water with the tap he had, but as it began to fill more of the cartons, he noticed that the puddle itself wasn't draining. How the hell? He grabbed the tail end of the pump and pushed it into the water. Before feeling it hit the end of the indentation, this crater was maybe a few feet wide. How was it not being drained by the water tap? Aw, what the hell, doesn't taste that bad anyways, he thought to himself. He began to march back to his shack, ready to gather all the containers he could find. He wouldn't run out of water this time. You guys won't believe it, but I found something really strange the other day. A water source. This one doesn't drain though. I've been pumping water from it all day long, and not a single drop has actually left the puddle. Filled up 6 canisters just off this one source. When you can, send one of your scientist boys down here. I don't know what the hell is going on, but I won't complain about it. Danny closed the laptop and turned around to see the creaky bed behind him. It had been a long and confusing few days, but it felt like he could finally relax. So much of his time had been spent just gathering resources to survive. Now this wasn't a problem. He could get the outpost finished in only a few more weeks. Exhausted, he laid down and drifted to sleep. hoping for a more productive day tomorrow. As he woke up the next morning, Danny could immediately feel something was wrong. It took him only a few seconds to notice. At first, lazily wandering around out of his hut and over to the new water source, but as he went to grab the water tap, he saw it. There was a second thumb sprouting out from the palm of his hand. He grabbed his hand in shock and gawked at the sight in front of him. The thumb was awkwardly protruding from a lopsided angle in his palm. The entire area of his hand was completely numb. After stomaching the courage, he pulled at the new appendage and felt a shock of pain emit from it. He fell to his side, grasping the hand firmly. Without thinking, he crawled over to the box of tools MEG had given him and picked the hacksaw from within the chest. He positioned it over the new thumb and grimaced. But he couldn't do it. He didn't have what it took to cut it off. He cursed himself and stood back up. What could have done this? Was there an entity he hadn't read about? A property of level 1 that... He looked back at the puddle of almond water. It almost seemed irrational, but somehow he knew not to trust it. He shouldn't have even gone drinking from it in the first place, because it no doubt had something to do with whatever the hell had happened to him. He shuddered, thinking about how much of it he had drunk over the past 2 days. Later that night, he opened a cabinet above his bed where he had kept almond water from previous nights. As he looked through the individual cartons, he grew even more frustrated. There was at least 8 of them, but he couldn't tell which ones were safe and which ones were contaminated. He slammed the cabinet shut in frustration. The shelf that supported it snapped, and the cartons of fresh almond water spilled all over him and his clothes. He yelled again and hit his hand against the wall before writhing in pain from the thumb on his hand having been smashed against the steel wall. If this water was what caused the growth, then he quickly got up and began to dry his face off with a quilt he had fallen earlier. He had been drenched in the stuff. After a few minutes, his face was dried and the puddle on the floor cleared up. He went to bed again, hoping for the best. He awoke the next day and quickly checked his hands. The thumb was still on his palm, now a gross crimson pigment from having been crushed last night. But other than that, nothing new had surfaced. He went to a mirror in his shack and anxiously looked at his face before spotting what was that? A hole. Yes, that's right. Slightly above his eye, a small hole had formed. It was an eyelid. An empty eyelid had grown above his left eye. He screamed. I don't know what the hell was in that water, but it was not safe. I need y'all to send a doctor or a researcher, someone equipped to deal with what the hell is going on out here. I want a response now. I need some goddamn help. Danny slammed the laptop shut in anger. He didn't sign up for any of this. It was meant to be a simple project. He thought about leaving, going back to Trader's Keep, but he knew it wasn't worth it. If the MEG got his message, they'd send a doctor out, and maybe they have an idea as to what the hell had happened to him. Or maybe they wouldn't. The thought scared him. Another week went by, with complete silence from the MEG. It had begun to dawn on Danny that they hadn't ever responded to any of his messages. He wasn't even sure if any of them had sent it. He had begun to decay further as well. Teeth started to sprout from his arms and face, almost like pimples. They started out small, but in only a few days, they were dotting his arms in a uniform pattern. A thick, bulging lump had grown on his back as well, which numbed his entire backside every moment he touched it. The reality of his situation was beginning to close in on him. Slowly but surely, he was changing, morphing into something ungodly, and no thanks to that damn water. He stood up from his bed and wandered over to the almond water source in question. He had stopped working a few days ago and started to hide in his house, waiting for whatever was happening to leave on in his own naive ignorance. The puddle hadn't gotten smaller. If anything, it was bigger. It was much darker, disgusting pigment than the last time he had seen it, and it smelled awful. Then again, so did he. He picked up the water tap and threw it into the puddle in anger. If it weren't for the damn MEG sending him on his mission, not giving him enough supplies, he wouldn't be dealing with this right now. But he was beyond the point of trying to find someone to blame. He knew that it was becoming more of a matter of figuring out what to do with himself. He pushed against the roof of his mouth with his tongue and felt a new protrusion. He was beginning to lose track of what was growing around where, and it was agonizing. Something in the water, killing me. Do not send anyone. Hurts to type. Thumbs growing everywhere. Don't send anyone. Can't send. And more messages now. If this one reaches you, do not send anyone. Goodbye. Another week had passed. If it weren't for having to send that final message to the MEG, he would have lost track by this point. Calluses and fingernails were going from almost every point in his body. The hole that was once an empty eyelid had grown into a disgusting, pupilless eye that burned in his head. The roof of his mouth was lined with new tongues and teeth, making it near impossible to speak and even harder to breathe. And the lump on his back had grown much larger, now beginning to turn into some sort of phlegm of its own. He got up from the laptop, barely mustering the energy to close it, and looked at himself in the mirror. He was a night nightmare. His skin was blackish red, fingers and bone protruding from his face. He turned into a small cabinet to the right of the mirror. There was one more option he hadn't considered yet. Inside the cabinet housed an old rusted shotgun loaded with a singular shell. He had no idea where he had gotten it. "Kill me, please." The shotgun blew off his head with a loud blast, killing him instantaneously. As he died, the rest of his body slowly began to wake up. A week had passed, and MEG settlers had finally arrived at Danny's settlement. There had been an outage in the MEG service a little under a month ago, and they hadn't received any messages from him since. Still, the MEG trusted him and told the settlers he was reliable. As they opened the gate to the outpost, they began to wander towards a lone shack in the middle of the makeshift camp, presumably Danny's. They quietly knocked on the front door, but heard no response. They opened it and saw what was left of Danny, slumped against the floor of the shack. Rogue fingers covering his body were crawling wildly against the floor. His legs spasmed in random and unpredictable directions, and his body bleeding from every orifice they could still clearly see. On his back, a new head was starting to form.